No lies, no distortions, just the facts and the truth about issues that matter. Facts First with Christian Esqueda.
Hello, good evening. Magandang gabi sa inyo lahat. I'm Christian Esquera. I'm the host of this Facts First program. Welcome to another episode tonight. Napaka-importante po na pag-uusapan natin ngayong gabi dahil of course related pa rin po ito sa eleksyon at related po ito doon sa paparating na administration. So for this particular episode, we will try to make sense of our choices last May 9 elections here in the Philippines, especially our choice for president and vice president. So nalaman natin, although the results are not yet official, the results will have to be made official by Congress, sitting as a board of canvassers basically for the presidential and vice presidential elections. So yun po, intayin natin yung formal proclamation ng presumptive winner for president si Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. and Mayor Sara Duterte for vice president. In the meantime, himayin natin yung naging choices ng mga Pilipino, yung mga ibinoto, at ano yung mga pwede nating abangan for the coming years, for the next 6 years here in the Philippines. We have a very special guest for tonight. He's very familiar for those taking up political science, those in the field of political science. Sikat na sikat po siya. He was the author of this seminal book. Ang title po, Booty Capitalism, The Politics of Banking in the Philippines. Tapos, more recently, hindi na ganun kabago, although this is just, I think, a couple of years ago, he edited and authored a portion of the book, Strong Patronage and Weak Parties. Yan. Tungkol po yan sa mga political dynasties at saka yung kahinaan ng political party system dito sa Pilipinas. Yung guest po natin for tonight, he is an American, okay, a scholar. He is a professor of comparative and Southeast Asian politics. He has written extensively about Philippine politics and political economy. He is the professor or a professor of political and social change at the Australian National University Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs. Yan. So medyo bigatin po yung guest natin for tonight. We'd like to welcome to our program Professor Paul Hutchcroft. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us here in Manila.
Magandang gabi, Christian. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and great to be on your program, No Holding Back.
Okay. That's a giveaway already, no? Nagtagalog bigla si Professor Paul Hutchcroft. He's an American.
Isang correction kung pwede, Christian. Americano, Australiano ako. Dual citizen na.
Okay, sorry.
Lumaki ako sa US. Tsaka ngayon may pangalawang citizenship sa Australia din.
Okay, American Australians.
Nandito ako nag-base since 2008, so almost 14 years now here in Australia.
In Canberra in particular, you're there now, right? Okay.
Right.
At saka lingid sa kaalaman ng iba, no? Bukod sa magaling siya mag-Filipino, he also speaks fluent Cebuano. Konting sample naman dyan, sir.
Itayan ng akong Cebuano Christian. Tsaka kinalawang ng Tagalog ko dahil matagal na hindi ako bumalik sa Pilipinas. Bumalik ako sa elections. Pero before that, 2 years plus that I wasn't able to get back. So, buti na lang pwedeng mag-practice ngayon para babalik pa rin ang Tagalog at Cebuano ko.
Okay. Don't worry, hindi ko kayo pipilitin mag-Filipino all throughout this interview. Konting patikim lang. Kasi nga, baka inisip ng iba. Ang topic natin for tonight is making sense of the Filipino vote. How we voted. Kasi di ba may kasabihan na you are what you vote. Di ba? Basically, that's a reflection of siguro iba, value system, culture, etc. etc. So, yun ang hihimayin natin for tonight. Yun nga, konting introduction na Professor Hutchcroft. How did you get involved with Philippine issues, Philippine affairs? How did the Philippines become a major aspect of your scholarship?
Actually, you have to go a long ways back, Christian, and it shows my age. So that back when I was, I think, 23 years old, I joined a program of the United Methodist Church, and I asked to go to West Africa. And in May of 1980, I learned that I was going to the Philippines instead. I think I was disappointed for all of about 5 or 6 hours. And then I got very excited about the opportunity of spending time in the Philippines. So in October of 1980, so what is that? Almost, my goodness, almost 42 years ago, I arrived in the Philippines. Of course, that was in the latter period of the Marcos regime, just at a point in which the regime was starting to show some major weakening. This was both because of the growing strength of the opposition, both the moderate opposition as well as the left, and then the financial scandals that hit. First, the one that came out of the so-called Dewey D affair, when a business person left the country welching on large quantity of debt, showing some structural deficiencies in the Philippine financial system, and especially the huge financial crisis that came in the wake of the assassination of Benigno Aquino on the tarmac of Manila Airport, and all of the huge opposition that came about. So I arrived in the Philippines before a lot of the huge opposition that had come into play, but it was very much beginning to be visible when I was in the Philippines throughout 1981.
So you know the Philippines very well, yung political issues in the Philippines, and also those experiences help plant the seeds for your seminal book. Tinatawag siya seminal because maraming fans siyang Booty Capitalism. No, is that correct?
Well, I was coming out of a more of a activist background, concerned about issues of human rights, concerned about U.S. support for the Marcos regime that was very much tied to U.S. desire to have unhampered use of its military bases. Moving on from that, I went to graduate school, and then found out that I have a lot of interest in deeper study. Went on for a PhD starting in 1987, and then it's at that point that I developed slowly an interest in. I knew I was going to do a topic having something to do with the Philippines, but it morphed into an interest in the nature of crony capitalism in the Philippines under Ferdinand Marcos. So I had an initial interest actually in doing a comparative study between Suharto's crony capitalism in Indonesia and that of Marcos, but then I settled on examination of the Philippines, and then more specifically at the banking sector, because the banking sector was such an important prism of power politics in the Philippine political economy. And it's a sector you would expect to be relatively more rational legal, but I showed very strong patrimonial elements in the banking sector. So starting before the Marcos years, in the late 50s, early 1960s, and then carrying it through the Marcos regime and into the early post-Marcos years, including the death of the central bank. Let's not forget that the central bank collapsed under the quite amazing ravages of the financial sector by the Marcos regime. So it died a death, and it had to be replaced by what we now have as the Bangko Sentral ng
BSP.
Pilipinas.
It had to be restructured.
Yes.
Ayan galing po yan sa isang scholar na talaga hindi po yan invento, hindi po yan disinformation, hindi po yan paninira ng programang to. So nakasulat po yan, that's very factual. Yung nagtatanong si Nacy or Nasi Mamaril, she missed the title of your book. Ang title ng book niya, Booty. Booty Capitalism. Yan. Mahanap niyan online. Anyway, so you saw firsthand how the experience was under Marcos Sr. And of course, he was ousted in 1986. But 36 years after or later, his son is set to assume the presidency. Does this surprise you in any way?
At one level, no, because the polls were definitely showing, the opinion polls were definitely showing that Marcos and that Bongbong Marcos and Sara had a huge margin. Those polls were registering that going all the way back to the December 2021 poll, and effectively it never stopped. They were achieving something that never had happened in the history of post-1986 politics, and that is a candidate registering more than 50%. So this was all very much unprecedented. So at one level, it's not surprising. At another level, for those of us who do know the Marcos regime and its ravages, both in terms of human rights abuses, as well as, let's not forget that they left the Philippines with what's known as the lost decade of the 1980s. It was not the golden era. It was the lost decade of the 1980s, in which the economy was completely on its knees, negative rates of growth. There were huge amounts of non-performing loans, many of them coming from so-called behest loans. What's a behest loan? Those were loans made at the behest of the president, benefiting his cronies. So whether it be the Philippine National Bank or the Development Bank of the Philippines, all of these banks were just sagging under huge levels of indebtedness, and the country as a whole had huge levels of foreign indebtedness. I think the myth of the golden years really would have emerged in the 1970s, because after the declaration of martial law in 1972, the U.S. gave critical support to the Marcos regime, and this allowed it to avail of huge amounts of petrodollars that were floating around the international system. And these were loans that were very unusual historically, because they were often at negative rates of real interest. So very cheap money that was out there for the Philippines to grab in the 1970s. And it's at that period that the Philippine economy looked, very falsely, as if it was doing well. That couldn't be further from the truth. And by the early 1980s, all of this indebtedness really began to show. All of it coming from crony capitalism. This is very well documented. For those that want to look at one of the seminal pieces on that, look at a study that came out from the University of the Philippines School of Economics in 1984 that speaks of the damage done to the Philippine economy by Marcos era crony capitalism. So all of this is very well documented, and now is being submerged in a effort to try to paint all of this as the so-called golden years.
Yeah, pero how come, despite all that, Filipinos voted by a huge majority, at least based on the results that we're seeing now, the son of the very official, the president, who put the Philippine economy in such shambles?
I think that that's a important question that many are trying to grapple with. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about it myself since the election results. Again, the election results at one level were anticipated. We knew that from the Pulse Asia surveys, which have shown themselves to be very accurate in terms of what the final results were. But the explanation behind all of this, the victory of Bongbong and Sara Duterte, I think needs to be divided up into at least three different categories of factors. There's a range of long-term factors, there's a range of medium-term factors, and then there are some short-term factors. And I'd be happy to go through some of these, but let me skip to the short-term factors, which I'm grouping as things that happened from late 2021 onward. And here it is critical to acknowledge the role of former President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo in brokering the deal between Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte. It's not inevitable that this might have taken place. What happened was a person of great stature able to come in and convince the two of them to run together as a tandem, and also, just as importantly, to convince Bongbong Marcos he didn't need convincing, to allow Bongbong Marcos to take the top of the ticket and to convince Sara to settle for the the vice presidential race. This is not inevitable that there be such a brokering deal. The Philippine electoral system is one that is very weakly structured. It does not have the institutional girth to really bring about well-structured competition. Now, all elections should theoretically be a matter to be decided by the voters. We know that. We want elections to have that degree of unpredictability because we want it to be the voice of the voters that will make the decision. But there's three elements of the Philippine electoral system that contribute to this lack of structuring, well-structured electoral competition. One is the fact that the president and vice president run separately. This is a very unusual system internationally. I think one of the few places that it is found is in Texas, say no more. It's very odd to have the executive and the vice executive running separately. The other element that leads to weakly structured electoral competition is that in the Philippines, one only needs a plurality rather than a majority. What do we mean by that? A plurality means you only need to get the most votes. You don't have to get a majority of the votes. And if we look at the system in, say, Indonesia, as well as what we've seen recently in France between Emmanuel Macron and
Marine Le Pen.
That required a second round of voting to make sure that somebody got a majority. Now, why does that matter? It means that you get a lot of candidates coming in on the hope that, well, maybe I can be the one to get that plurality, even when they don't think they'd really have an opportunity to get a majority. So it leads to a large number of candidates that are coming in. And Exhibit A in all of this is the 1992 election. And in that election, there were 7 different candidates that were running. And who won? We all know, Fidel Ramos. What was his percentage? He won with a mere 23.6% of the vote. And that is a very weak mandate that he, through the skill of his leadership, was able to bring in to develop a larger mandate for himself. But if we look back at that election, there's 2 candidates that actually came from the same camp, and that is Imelda Marcos and Eduardo Danding Cojuangco. Between the 2 of them, they actually received 28.5%. So if there had been someone to broker that, maybe Imelda is looking now and thinking, how come there was no GMA that helped me back in 1992 to be able to work out a deal with Danding Cojuangco? If those 2 had come together in 1992, they could have won the election. So the plurality is something that we don't see important in this election in the outcome, because we have the unprecedented result of Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte both achieving more than 50% of the vote. But it did create a dynamic, lots of candidates, and requirement for this critical brokering. The final element that leads to weakly structured coming out of the post-authoritarian background, the framers of the 1987 Constitution wanted to make sure that there wouldn't be another Marcos. That's why there is a one-term president. But in the Philippines, as well as in Korea, that has one term for its president, it leads to weak organization of political parties because the president does not have any incentive to engage in party building. So that's a bit of background, Christian, on the weakly structured nature of electoral competition in the Philippines, and why it was so critical, and we might take it for granted now, but we shouldn't, why it was so critical that Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo came in and brokered this deal between Bongbong Marcos and Duterte, made sure that they were not running against each other and thus splitting the vote, as happened in 1992 between Imelda and Danding Cojuangco, but combining. And once they combined, that really created a very strong bandwagon effect. Sara was able to push up Bongbong's popularity ratings, and together as a tandem, they started to develop the sense of being a juggernaut that was completely unstoppable. So that's a bit of background on the structure. And just to emphasize again what we have at the bottom of the screen, the role of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo in the Marcos-Duterte victory.
Okay. So basically, Gloria Arroyo can be considered as some sort of a game changer in this particular elections, because you're looking at 10 candidates for president compared to 7 in 92. So somehow that made it much easier for the Duterte Marcos tandem to bag
Yeah,
it
she
the
only needed to
victory.
concentrate on the two that were in her camp. And then out of that came a seemingly unbeatable combination of bailiwicks. Of course, we have the Marcos bailiwick in the north. We have the Duterte bailiwick in the south, which also reaches into major popularity in the central Visayas. Then we have the Arroyo bailiwick in central Luzon. Then we have the relatives, the Romualdezes, right? And then we have in the most vote-rich province of the Philippines the important role
Cebu.
of Gwen Garcia and also Mayor Mike Rama, very quickly bringing their support to the Marcoses. So this created this is traditional Philippine politics, right? Combining bailiwicks, and this was the start. And then on top of that comes the very well-coordinated social media effort of manipulating the historical record, making the Marcoses seem like just fantastic folks to be around. They're funny. They have a good sense of humor. The father and the son can be jocular with one another. All those things that both related to the past, the golden years, but also bringing in a new generation, bringing in Sandro and his generation with all of their appeal to younger voters.
Yeah, and speaking of disinformation and fake news, let's flash this comment coming from one troll, because every episode, 3 times a week, we have a designated troll or trolls assigned to us. For tonight, his or her name is Music Lover. Sobrang bobo mo talaga. Tingnan. Mukha kang fake news. But I
So,
don't know whether you're following.
ikaw pala ang bobotante,
Yeah,
Christian.
bobo pala ako.
I didn't realize that before.
Yeah. My apologies, dear troll, because my IQ is so low, perhaps bordering on stupidity. But anyway,
A
you
good
can,
example.
yeah, you can log out now because I've read your comment already. So, pwede ka nang maningil. Okay? Yeah. Okay, let's proceed to some proper intelligent discussion. Yung talagang away from the influence of trolls. So yeah, you mentioned the factor of Gloria Arroyo in this particular election. Without that broker, without GMA brokering that political deal or alliance between Bongbong and Sara Duterte, what do you think would have happened?
We don't know, but quite possibly the Marcoses and the Dutertes might have gone their own way and been rivals rather than allies in the election, and then never developed the sense of momentum, never developed the sense of juggernaut, never developed the bailiwicks. The social media manipulation might never have been able to develop the traction that it did, and it's possible that another candidate might have developed that critical bit of momentum, but we really don't know. It's speculative to know the exact direction of all of this, but it's clear that without the broker, GMA, helping to bring these two candidates together, we could have seen a very different landscape for this election. But there's a number of contextual factors too, going much further back, Christian, that also need to be brought into the fore. So I've highlighted that role of GMA. But if we go further back, there's the longer term factors. The fact that the family had always been able to evade criminal prosecution, that they had never been banned from political office as some people wanted to do after 1986. All the disappointments with the 30 years of the post-Marcos era. But let's not forget that 12 years of that post-Marcos era between 1998 and 2010 were under Estrada and Arroyo, who ended up align with Marcos. So it can't be blamed simply on one political faction in the past. It's a shared responsibility, I think, to look at the major deficiencies in the quality of government, as well as the less than rapid progress in reducing poverty. Then there's this long-term Marcos effort to try to rehabilitate their names, including in textbooks, and the porosity, apparently, of the Department of Education, that they can come in and have the capacity to influence textbooks. And the flip side of that is the failure of post-Marcos governments to develop real truth-telling mechanisms about the ways in which the Marcos dictatorship had been involved in such rampant human rights abuses and led to such enormous economic dislocation. The other thing is that a lot of the stories, by the time we're hitting this period, are being told by older people. And what they had to say seemed to be a distant memory, I think, to the youth of the Philippines. I think what we've probably seen in the Philippines is more of an authoritarian amnesia, forgetting the past, than an authoritarian nostalgia. So it's
which is worse? Which do you think is worse?
I think they both feed into each other, but who was it? Bob Marley, who said, "You've got to know your history." There's no excuse for not knowing your history, and to rely on it's important for all citizens to get a sense of the historical experience of the Philippines, both in terms of its major contributions to worldwide democracy. Philippine 1986 People Power Revolution had a huge influence around the world, as well as to understand those authoritarian lows as well. So history is very important, and I think that we've seen that very clearly. So those are some of the longer-term factors. There's a range of medium-term factors that I think we could look at between 2016 and 2021. The Marcoses began with a very, very wise investment in 2016 in the Duterte campaign, presumably providing very important financial resources. Remember Duterte saying he didn't have much money back in around October of 2021, but I'm sorry, October 2015, but then he ended up having substantial resources and, very importantly, having a social media effort, which is said to have been built on the Marcos social media effort. So it was a very wise investment on the part of the Marcos regime. Then Duterte was able to use social media to pull down the scaffolding of the yellow element of Philippine politics. Let's not forget that Noynoy Aquino actually ended his term in 2016 with respectable popularity ratings, but then there was just a strong hit at him, and most importantly at Lenny, that was critical. He boosted popular support for his authoritarian impulses, and then more directly as utang to the Marcoses for what they had done in the campaign. He allowed the hero's burial of the former dictator in Libingan ng mga Bayani, invited the family to a visit to the palace, etc. Just generally helped to rehabilitate. So those are some of the factors that I think help to explain the victory of Bongbong Marcos. It's not just the short-term factors. It's not just the long-term factors. It's a combination of short, medium, and long-term factors.
Okay. Sige, bago ko itanong yung next question ko, Professor Hutchcroft, sagutin lang natin tong comment ni Edward Guerrero. Bakit ba kasi nakikialam ang mga dayuhan sa Pilipinas? Hindi naman sila tumira dito. Una-una, tama ka, dayuhan siya, pero matagal siyang tumira sa Pilipinas. He's married to a Filipina for 33 years. At pangalawa, misplaced yung patriotism mo, Edward, ha? Pag sinunod natin yan, lahat tayo parang isla, no? Bawal mag-comment. Hindi tayo pwede mag-comment sa nangyayari sa Ukraine, sa China, sa Vietnam. Hindi po ganyan ang takbo ng mundo, okay? Borderless po tayo ngayon. And kung nanonood ka nung simula, we lay the predicate, the experience of Professor Hutchcroft, how he has written extensively about the Philippines. Kaya nga tama yung sabi ni Karaoke Chewbox. This foreigner knows more about Marcos atrocities than an average or the average Filipino in the Philippines. That says a lot about a big number of Filipinos today. Ako na po sumagot, Professor Hutchcroft. Kasi parang sa classroom lang yan, di ba, yung mga late dumating tapos bigyan nag-comment. Anyway, I'd like to go to this issue of how solid do you think is this alliance
Let me just make
involving...
one point there.
Okay, go.
Christian, some of the greatest insights on American politics came from a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was writing in the 19th century. So it's a long tradition of foreigners being able to offer some insights, and I welcome insights by Filipinos looking at either Australian or American politics. I'm sure there is a great deal to be said just based on the comparative insights that someone can bring in from outside the country.
Okay. Edward, may bago ka natutunan, I hope. Okay. Yung alliance involving Duterte, Marcos, and Arroyo, the one that was brokered by Gloria Arroyo, how solid do you think this is? And given their backgrounds, their predispositions, how long do you think this would endure?
I don't have my crystal ball working right now, Christian, but I would say that I think it's a useful question to ask. To whom does Bongbong Marcos have very substantial utang na loob in the wake of the elections? And I welcome other insights, but my sense is that his most substantial utang is to just two people, and not very broadly to others. Now, who are those two people? We've already highlighted both of them. The first is Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, and the second is Sara Duterte. He has very substantial utang, I would say, to both of these people. And then, of course, there's a range of local politicians around the country that have given assistance. But that has to be tempered with the fact that the Marcoses were also giving a lot of money out to local politicians to get their support. So obviously, there's not as much utang to people to whom you've given substantial support in their own campaign. So I think really it comes down to two major figures to whom there is very substantial debt of gratitude, and that is both GMA as well as Sara Duterte. He hasn't needed to get support from major conglomerates, as is so often the case in the past, because presumably he's been able to self-finance the election. So all of this is really a very interesting position for a president to come in and not have major utang, either to any major domestic actors or foreign actors. He can chart his own course, and we really don't know the dynamics of the presidency. I think it's really worth looking at the three women that are very important in the life of Bongbong Marcos. First of all, his mother. At age 92, hard to say how long she will continue to have strong influence. Secondly, there is his sister, Amy Marcos. And, if you were going to pull up the Marcos politician that is the most diligent and who has the strongest achievements, it would clearly be Amy Marcos and not Bongbong Marcos. But for whatever reason, perhaps the patriarchy of the mother, it's the son that got picked. As he said, since I was 3 years old, my mother has wanted me to be president. So Amy has to figure in as a key woman in his life. And then thirdly, of course, Lisa Araneta Marcos. And we don't know how these different forces are going to interact with each other, including that of also bringing in GMA and Sarah, how all of these different voices are going to be adjudicated over time. So I think that's a critical thing, Christian, to be watching as we try to understand the Marcos administration.
That's a very interesting point that you mentioned, Professor Hutchcroft. Finally, I know you're an advocate of systemic and structural reforms to basically somehow influence in a positive way attitudes of voters on election day. So you mentioned earlier the importance of a strong political party system, which is non-existent in the Philippines. We have a political party system, but it's very weak, as you've written about extensively. A big part of the reform would entail overhauling the Philippine Constitution, and in any administration, talk of revising the Constitution is floated. But in this case, under Marcos Jr. Administration, they think the atmosphere would be conducive to somehow tinkering with the Philippine Constitution, just like what they did under Duterte.
Yeah, I mean, Duterte came in with a slogan of federalism. I think in many ways that was what one scholar has called a false flag. He talked the talk of decentralization and federalism when actually he was a very strongly centralizing president, intimidating local politicians and making sure that they fall in line. So we didn't really see any major push towards constitutional revision under Duterte, despite all of the sloganeering, and that came forth in 2019 when he basically gave up on it, and he said, federalism or whatnot, we need to do something to change the Constitution. It was very vague, and there was never any strong push for federalism. Now, what about Bongbong? He has a party that I can't remember the name of it. Can anybody remember the name of Bongbong's party? I mean, it's one of the most obscure institutions around, but it has federalism in the
Partido
title.
Federal ng Pilipinas, I think.
Salamat. Okay. He's got the name federalism in his supposed political party that is not at all a viable institution moving forward. I don't think we should expect it to see anything of it. I really don't expect Christian to see a major push for constitutional revision, but I may be wrong. I could be completely wrong on that. The problem with trying to predict what will happen in a Marcos presidency is that he has not provided any clear program or platform moving forward. He's got a slogan, unity, but that is not a program or a platform by any means. And I think that right now there's a certain unsettled view in the markets among the business community is what is this guy actually going to do? And I checked today on when did the incoming Duterte camp come up with an economic plan, just a basic 8-point economic agenda that came on just 3 days after the election. So they were prepared. We had Sonny Dominguez, we had Ernie Pernia, and others that were ready to project after the election some kind of agenda for the sake of the business community, not the voter, to let them know this is what we want to do, to let them know that, okay, Duterte said, he was going to kill tens of thousands of people, but he does have an economic plan as well. And that helped to settle down the markets. What we haven't seen under Duterte is any sort of agenda, let alone hints as to who might be filling some of these key posts. I think that it's only, correct me if I'm wrong, as of today, we've only gotten 2 cabinet appointments. One, Sarah was given the unenviable task of trying to fix the Philippine educational system, which has been in huge crisis amidst the pandemic and even earlier. And then we have Abalos, the campaign manager, that has been given DILG. But if I'm not mistaken, that's it. And we are already 7 days beyond the election. I think that the markets would want to hear something reassuring beyond, oh, this is a unity president. So when you ask me, will he push for constitutional revision? I think the answer is we don't have a clue. We just don't have a clue because he said so little about what his platform. Basically, the Philippine voters, by giving him, what is it, 58% of the vote have basically written a blank check to someone who they have no idea what he might actually do.
Okay, and that we can only hope for the best. Thank you very much, Professor Paul Hutchcroft, for joining us tonight from Canberra. Let's do this again. We have a lot to talk about still.
Maraming salamat, Christian. As I said, always a pleasure to talk with you, and appreciate the insights of your viewers as well. And it's been a great honor to be part of your program. No holding back.
Okay. Maraming salamat po, Professor Paul Hutchcroft from the Australian National University. Good evening, sir.
Great. Good evening. Thanks very much, Christian. Okay. Good night.
Okay, so natapos po yung first part ng ating programa ngayon. So, medyo nakakatuwa yung mga comments dito regarding the discussion. I hope naging useful yung discussion sa inyo kasi ang usapan natin dito very hinged din also on systemic and structural reforms. Kaya nga ang topic natin is making sense of the Filipino vote last May 9. May ilang nagtatanong dito, bakit ba puro Marcos ang topic mo? Siya po kasi nanalo, di ba? Kung iba po yung nanalo, di iba yung pag-uusapan natin. Simple as that. Don't get offended if journalists focus on issues involving any candidate. Issue po ito. I have nothing personal about Bongbong Marcos. I've covered him before when he was a senator. I don't have anything against him. You don't have to put any malice in what we do. Ito po kasi yung mga issues na dapat nalalaman. Hindi siya dapat nililibing. They're not supposed to be swept under the rug. Kasi pag ginawa mo yun, di magmumukha ka naman bayaran, di ba? So, kung ayaw nyo ng ganitong content, kung ayaw nyo ng ganitong discussion, which are very legitimate, as discussed by Professor Paul Hutchcroft earlier, what happened during the Marcos years under the father, hindi mo pwedeng kalimutan yan eh. Of course, in the coming episodes, pag-uusapan natin what to expect under the Marcos presidency, his choice of cabinet officials. Problema, wala pa nga eh. But in one of the upcoming episodes, pag-uusapan natin yung si Sara Duterte as the incoming vice president and also as the presumptive education secretary, what she has to offer.